Hi everyone, and welcome to the home stretch. We're almost there. We're 2/3 of the way through the course, so pat yourself on the back for making it this far. Now, I'm a bit behind, but then that's always the case this time of year. Whether I'm teaching face-to-face or online, I always preemptively leave a bit of slack in the schedule so that I can get caught up, and we will get caught up. Last I remember, we were talking about circulation. We were talking about the functions of the circulatory system, and we were talking about the heart and how the heart works. If you recall, the heart, especially the left ventricle, pumps out blood under quite a bit of pressure. That blood goes out to very, very fine little vessels in the capillary beds, and fluid seeps out into the tissues. That fluid gives rise to the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between cells. This fluid bathes the cells and provides them with oxygen and nutrients, etc. Most of that is going to be recollected at the other end of the capillary bed, but about 15% of it isn't. That 15% is going to have to be recollected somehow, and it's recollected into the lymphatic system. In this diagram, we have an oddly happy fellow showing off his lymphatic system. The fluid or lymph collected by the system makes its way back to the subclavian veins and then back to the heart. Along the way, this fluid passes through a whole lot of lymph nodes. And lymph nodes serve as little traps where macrophages and other components of the immune system can deal with debris or foreign cells that shouldn't be in that fluid. The lymphatic system consists of lymphatic vessels, which are very similar to veins in many ways. Like veins, they have valves and they have very thin walls. The system also consists of lymphatic tissues and organs, like the spleen and lymph nodes. The goal of this system is to return interstitial fluid that was derived from plasma back to the bloodstream. Once this interstitial fluid enters into lymph vessels or lymph tissues, we refer to it as lymph. But the composition of lymph and interstitial fluid and plasma are very similar. A number of organs are part of this system, and these organs are also part of the immune system. The lymphatic system plays a role in immunity. We'll talk about that a little bit in this lecture, but we'll talk about that more in microbiology. Red bone marrow, the thymus, the spleen, lymph nodes, Peyers patches, etc., they're all part of this extensive system. An important thing to note, and you can see this in the little diagram in the middle, is that the lymphatic system is rather asymmetrical. We expect symmetry when looking at the human body, but this is not always the case when it comes to internal organs and organ systems. Remember, we also saw similar asymmetries in the circulatory system. Okay, let's take a look at what happens at the tissue level. On the right, you're seeing a capillary bed. Blood is coming in from the right and leaving through the left of the diagram. Notice that the capillary bed is intertwined with lymph vessels. They're collecting any excess fluid that wasn't recollected into venules and then into veins. This network of tubules collect fluid, and then, as you can see on the diagram on the left, that fluid is going to be recollected through lymph nodes and passed into the rest of the lymphatic system. The nodes will hopefully trap and remove debris, dead cells and bits of cells, microbes, bacteria, and perhaps even cancerous cells that have detached and found their way into circulation. The lymph is effectively filtered and treated as it passes through these nodes. Recall that your blood always flows through tubes. After it leaves the heart, the tubes get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the capillary beds, and then the tubes get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but the blood is always flowing through tubes. The lymphatic system is a little bit different. It starts as blind-ended lymph capillaries. These are tiny little vessels, just like capillaries, but they have a beginning. They have a start to them. They collect fluid, and then that fluid leads to larger vessels. The fluid flows in just one direction. At this point, once that fluid has been collected into these vessels, it is known as lymph. Here we're zoomed in on the beginning of a lymph vessel. The tiniest lymph vessels are referred to as lymph capillaries. We have a capillary bed, and you can see that we've got oxygenated blood coming down on the right, deoxygenated returning venous blood on the left. And we've got a capillary bed between these two vessels. We've got lots of tissue cells too, and we've got fluid that's leaking out and filling the space between these cells. The fluid is under pressure. A lot of it is going to be collected by the venules, most of it in fact, and returned to the circulation directly. Some of it, the excess, is going to make its way slowly into the lymphatic vessels, and it's going to be collected by these blind-ended vessels and ultimately be returned back to the circulatory system. Now, how does this work? It's similar to venous flow. Let's take a closer look at the smallest vessels. They are blind-ended microscopic tubes, and they're made up of very thin squamous cells. These cells overlap, but they are not rigidly attached to each other. If the pressure exerted by the interstitial fluid is greater than the outward force of the lymph, which is likely, gaps will open, allowing interstitial fluid to move into the lymph vessel. Because of the way the cells overlap, fluid can move in, but it can't easily move out. High pressure in the lymph vessel will cause these gaps to close. There are also anchoring filaments that anchor the ends of the lymphatic capillary to the surrounding tissue cells. Larger lymphatic collecting vessels are similar to veins, but they have thinner walls and they have more valves, and that's because the fluid is moving entirely under compression. Movements of the body move fluid through the system, and the fluid experiences rather low propulsive force, lower even than we see in the veins. In the veins, at least, there is some suction being generated by the heart. Lymph vessels anastomize or branch more frequently. The high level of branching allows them to collect as much fluid from the interstitial fluid as possible, but also adds a great deal of resistance. It's a passive system that should drain tissues whenever we have fluid buildup in tissues. For those of you doing microbiology, which I think is most of you, we will talk about elephantitis of the lower limbs. There are a few conditions that can cause blockage of lymph nodes and vessels and prevent the removal of excess fluid. And this, as you might imagine, causes extensive bloating and damage of tissues. Large, deep lymphatic vessels travel along arteries that supply the vessels with oxygen and nutrients, and the fluid ultimately is going to be dumped back into the venous blood flow so that the fluid can be put back into circulation. This happens at the subclavian veins, as you can see here. We have two ducts that will take the fluid and put it back into circulation. We have a right lymphatic duct that drains the right upper arm and the right side of the head and thorax. Then we have the thoracic duct that drains the rest of the body. It's very asymmetric, perhaps the most asymmetric system of the body. To recap, the plasma is the fluid portion of the blood, and it seeps out into the interstitial space between tissue cells. It will contain a lot of nutrients and oxygen and signaling molecules and hormones, etc., etc., and whatever is not recollected by the circulatory system needs to be recollected by the lymphatic system. This fluid, this lymph, within the lymphatic system is under very, very low pressure. It doesn't have a pump of its own, and it's returned simply through movements of your body. It's returned through muscular contractions, and it's returned through the movements of breathing. Basically, any movement that you make is going to squeeze these lymph vessels. Because they have valves, the fluid is going to move in only one direction, and it's going to make its way back to the subclavian veins. Lymphocytes hang out within the lymphatic tissue, and they consist of T cells and B cells. We'll talk about these a bit more in microbiology, but they manage the immune response. They identify things that are potentially troublesome and target them for attacks by the other cells and compounds of the immune system. B cells produce antibodies. Antibodies bind to antigens. Remember that antigens are foreign proteins that could perhaps be attached to a bacterium, or they could be toxins. There are many more types of leukocytes, or white blood cells, that are also found within the lymphatic system. Macrophages, for instance, will phagocytize or ingest foreign substances, and they also ingest debris as well. They may present pieces of cells that they have killed to T cells and activate them. They provide T cells with targets. Basically, they play a game of show and tell. They'll take foreign cells apart and take potential antigens, display them on their surface, and tell the rest of the immune system that you should be looking for this stuff. You're seeing a dendritic cell here. These are cells that possess very thin branching pseudopodia. The pseudopodia wrap themselves around foreign cells and foreign debris and bring them into the cell. Reticular cells produce a connective framework or scaffold within the very loose lymphatic tissue where we tend to find these cells. Reticular fibers form a scaffold that will help protect the tissue and give the cells of the tissue something to attach to. The spleen is an excellent example of a very soft tissue that requires this internal scaffold. You have lymph nodes in your neck, your armpits, and your groin. You have them all over, in fact, but those are the most obvious areas. You can feel these nodes, particularly if you're fighting an infection. The neck is probably the most obvious. Lymph nodes impede the flow of lymph. It takes a little extra time for lymph to get through a lymph node because it's kind of like a maze. And as the fluid passes through the lymph node, lymphatic cells have a chance to find something that's foreign and break it down and destroy it. Your immune system has a chance to generate antibodies and so on against these foreign materials. Lymph nodes are encapsulated structures. They're walled off from the rest of your body by rather strong, dense connective tissue. And that makes sense because, well, there might be something rather nasty in a lymph node. It needs to be separated from surrounding tissues. Lymph nodes contain T cells, macrophages, B cells, dendritic cells, and other important cells of the immune system. Lymph that enters into a lymph node enters through what are called afferent lymphatic vessels. Afferent, with an A, means towards. The lymph leaves the nodes through efferent, with an E, vessels. Efferent means away from. Here we have a highly idealized version of a lymph node. The tissue in the middle serves as kind of a filter. Lymph is coming in at the top and leaving at the bottom. Note that there's a lot of blood flow to this area. Blood contains leukocytes, and leukocytes can leave blood vessels. Recall that red blood cells don't do this. They stay within the blood vessels, but white blood cells can and do leave if they need to. They can wander into surrounding tissues, including, of course, lymphatic tissues. If foreign cells have been concentrated by a lymph node, white blood cells can leave the incoming blood and help fight that infection. Lymph nodes contain a maze of reticular tissue. This scaffold of fibers supports very soft, loose tissue. Solid trabeculae add to the maze-like quality of the organ and further impede the flow of lymph. In the diagram here, you're seeing lymph coming in from the bottom and leaving through the top. The lymph's slow, tortuous route provides more time for macrophages and lymphocytes to do their thing. Here we have lymph entering on the left and leaving on the right of a lymph node. Notice that all the lymph vessels have valves. As you move around and your skeletal muscles constrict, they're going to compress these very thin-walled vessels, and fluid can only move in one direction. It's going to be forced into the lymph node and then forced out of the lymph node. Remember again, there is no dedicated pump in the lymphatic system. We don't have a heart like we see in the circulatory system. There are several larger organs that are associated with the lymphatic system. First of all, we have tonsils, we have the thymus, we have the spleen, and we have Peyers patches. There's also extensive lymphatic tissue associated with the appendix, as we will discuss. The spleen, thymus gland, and tonsils are comprised of lymphatic tissue. Peyers patches are little bits of lymphatic tissue that are in close association with the intestines. If you were paying attention when dissecting your fetal pigs in lab, you might have noticed some of these little bits of what looks like glandular tissue. All of these tissues are supported by reticular connective tissue. They're very soft and require reticular fibers to provide structural support. Again, these organs help protect the body and support the activities of the immune system. The spleen is the largest of the lymphoid or lymphatic organs. When you were dissecting your pig in lab, you would have noticed, hopefully, that the spleen is thin and leaf-shaped. It stretches across the abdominal cavity in the pig. But that's not the case in the human. In a human, it's far more compact. It's located on the left side of the abdominal cavity, just below the diaphragm. As mentioned a few times now, it's a soft organ, and it's easily damaged because of this. It's also very well vascularized. It has an excellent blood supply for reasons that we've talked about. If you have a car accident or other severe trauma to the abdominal region, that may cause considerable bleeding from the spleen. The spleen is variable in shape and size from one person to the next. It's not uncommon for some people to have spleens with more than one lobe. Count yourself lucky if this is the case with you, because a huge chunk of the spleen could be surgically removed if necessary, and the other lobe could still function normally. The spleen plays a role in lymphocyte proliferation and maturation. Lymphocytes wander around the spleen and break down worn-out red blood cells and cleanse the blood of debris. Now, these activities can be performed elsewhere, however, so it is feasible to function normally as an adult without a spleen. Within the fetus, the spleen is an important site for the production of red blood cells. After birth, however, this role is taken over by bone marrow. Recall that red blood cells have a short lifespan of about only 2 months or so. When they're destroyed, globin is broken down into amino acids that can then be reused by cells throughout the body. Also, the iron that's found in hemoglobin needs to be recycled. The macrophages in the spleen that break down the red blood cells take that iron and stick it to transferrin, which then transports it back to the bone marrow where it can be used to make new red blood cells. An unrelated role of the spleen is the storage of platelets, and this occurs throughout the life of an individual. As we also saw in lymph nodes, the spleen has a capsule that helps isolate it from the rest of the body. There are 2 distinct areas within the spleen. We have the white pulp that contains a large population of lymphocytes, and the red pulp that contains the macrophages responsible for disposing of worn-out red blood cells. And we can see here just how well the spleen is vascularized. It's a maze of capillaries. It's really just a big blood sponge. Again, it is very soft, so be careful with your spleen. The thymus is an interesting component of the lymphatic system because it's also part of the endocrine system. It's an endocrine gland. It produces thymosin and other hormones that can activate and promote the maturity of T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes get their name from the thymus. The T stands for thymus. If you dissected a fetal pig in the lab, you should have noticed that this gland was rather large. It covers a portion of the mediastinum and the heart. But in both pigs and humans, it atrophies later in life, and it becomes far less prominent in the adult. It's often replaced by fat. Lymphoid tissue found within the submucosa of the digestive system makes up what's known as the MALT, M-A-L-T, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. As you might imagine, it's really important that your body protects you and your circulation from bacteria that are taken in when you eat food, because food contains a lot of bacteria, spores, and other potential pathogens. Tonsils are lymphoid organs occurring within the pharynx, and they form distinct bodies. We have the palatine tonsils that lie at the posterior end of the soft palate. The lingual tonsils are found at the base of the tongue. Pharyngeal tonsils are also known as adenoids, and they occur in the nasopharynx. No doubt you've heard of the adenoids before. They can become quite swollen and painful and may need to be removed. There are tubal tonsils, which surround the openings of the auditory or eustachian tubes in the pharynx. They can cause problems if they swell because, of course, if they do so, they will close off those tubes and limit the ability of the middle ear to properly pressurize itself. On the surface of tonsils are deep depressions known as crypts. These little caves or blind sacs collect bacteria and debris. White blood cells will migrate into these crypts and destroy that bacteria and debris. So the tonsils allow for a preemptive strike against pathogens during their initial entry into the body. But tonsils can become kind of a war zone in this fight, and this tissue may be overwhelmed and it may become infected and inflamed. Here you can see the location of the tonsils. You may have had tonsillitis as a kid. I know I certainly did, repeatedly. This term usually refers to inflammation of the palatine tonsils specifically, and it's very common in children. If they became infected and swollen, you might have had them removed. If they were infected but you still have them, you may notice that they are quite enlarged now. This is the result of scar tissue, but should not be of concern. My tonsils are huge. Peyers patches are clusters of lymphoid tissue that are found in the wall of the small intestine. Bacteria that make their way through the intestinal wall will hopefully become trapped in this tissue and destroyed. Lymphocytes within this tissue are constantly exposed to microbes and may generate a memory of these bacteria that can aid with long-term immunity. Again, this is something we'll talk about more in Biology 105. On the right, you can see a cross-section through the small intestine. The large grape-like structures you see in this histological section are the Peyers patches. Their role is, once again, to trap any bacteria that might otherwise make their way into capillaries and thus enter into systemic circulation. That would be a bad thing. You've probably heard that the appendix doesn't do a whole lot for us. It's this weird little appendage. It doesn't lead anywhere, and it can be removed and you'll be quite all right without it. Remember back to when we did our pig dissections again. Where the small intestine meets the large intestine in a pig, there's a large sac called the cecum. We have this structure too. It's at the base of the appendix, but in the pig it's much, much larger, and it definitely does serve a valuable function. It's a long coiled appendage. It delays the passage of food through the digestive system, so there's more time for the pig to break down the cellulose-heavy plant matter that they eat. The cecum and the attached appendix in us is small, but it's surrounded by a lot of lymphatic tissue. It's thought that maybe it helps prime the immune system. There are a lot of bacteria within the appendix, and there are a few species that seem to prefer the appendix. This is a location where lots of bacteria are exposed very directly to the immune system. The immune system has a chance to see and analyze all of the antigens that are present. Long story short, the appendix might not be totally useless in us. It might strengthen our immune response and our immune memory. And that concludes our short introduction into the lymphatic system, a separate, distinct system that most people probably don't realize they have. And of course, we're ending, as always, with our terminology.